we're going to move into our time of teaching with Corina. And we're going to talk a little bit about deepening our timeline conversation. So take it away, Corina.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Okay, so we're going to spend some time talking about deepening the timeline. It was so great to hear just the impact that timeline can have. It's kind of one of the foundational pieces of identity, right? It's the thing that kind of brings it all together. And so we really want to spend a little bit of time talking about facilitating that. So this is all in the context of you facilitating it. I'm going to talk about it a little bit, and then Jessica's going to share her timeline with us, and Tiffany and I are going to role model a little facilitating and co-facilitating based on today's lesson. So I think the first thing, oh, hang on. Just want to confirm you can see my screen. Okay. Something happened when I tried to move it forward. So let's see. There we go. Okay, so the first part is that the timeline really provides insight that are related to self-leadership, and it supports that idea of self-leadership. And to lead yourself, you first need to really understand yourself and why you do things the way you do them. And this is why we do strength finders, and it's also why we do the timeline, to gain those insights. So as facilitators, we can help the people who are in these workshops or in the Zoe training to dig deeper. So they're going to do their basic work, but your role is really to help them dig a little bit deeper. And that in turn supports that self-leadership. And for those of you who have done Thrive, we really get into that self-leadership and go back to that timeline in the Thrive course. So it's relevant both for identity and again for Thrive. So there are really three pillars to self-leadership. There's that self-awareness piece, there's self-reflection, and then self-mastery. So we're starting in identity with creating that self-awareness. And as facilitators, we help people do some of that self-reflection. And timelines help develop those pieces. And, we heard this from Bethany, it can be uncomfortable. But that's also where a lot of the impact is, right? Think about those times in your life where you've been most uncomfortable, but you get the most growth. So we've got to figure out how to manage that tension as facilitators around respecting where people are at and yet helping them do that little bit of a dig deeper. And so you got to trust God in that and really spend some time praying about it in advance and really paying attention to what's going on with people. Timelines help give that perspective. So, you learn to see participants as leaders. They are entrusting you in this process. So that's important. Help them to recognize and embrace the growth phases in their life. So your role, helping them to recognize that growth. We heard that piece around look for God in it. I think, Bethany, you mentioned that. That's exactly the idea, right? That's where the growth comes in. So as they begin to understand where they're going, the chances are they're going to be more effective in their ministry and they're going to move to that self-mastery piece. So again, it kind of links to those three elements. And we can help others grow by growing ourselves. And some of that is really sharing a little bit about your story. So knowing, kind of the appropriateness of what you can share in your experience in the timeline, and that it's a normative experience for Christians to struggle and grow, right? That the struggle is real and we all face it. So that's an important piece of it. So benefits of the timeline are many. They really help us to tell our story. So sharing timelines with someone can be incredibly therapeutic, right? You can show someone where you've been and how it shaped you. I love it. Was just so apropos, Bethany, what you said, like people didn't know the details of their story and the timeline helped to draw that out. It helps them to understand better. The timeline helps you make connections. So when you see it all in that line, right, it draws it all out, and then you can see the connections between different people, different events, possibly where you the growth that you were in the valley that you couldn't see when you were actually in the valley. It helps us identify patterns. I find that's a big one that we as facilitators can sometimes notice that people might not notice when they share their timeline. So what are the different patterns of behavior that are coming out? That visual piece, both negative and positive patterns, we tend to focus on negativity. And so as a facilitator, make a concerted effort to look for some of the good, right? Really to edify and lift them up in the process, especially for those people who are really struggling. And it also helps us to grieve. They can be visual representations of what's been lost. Telling the story of the loss can be practical in the grieving process. Sometimes things have been buried for so long they never had the opportunity to grieve them or be in a safe environment. Now, you don't want to slip into the counseling, so you have to kind of figure out that balance, but there is opportunity here. And if they need more support, don't forget, you have that list as a facilitator that you created when you first started facilitating, and there's an opportunity here to kind of link them to that. And timelines really help us remember what we've forgotten, and they remind us of what God's done, and where he has been at work. And we really like to try and focus in on that as much as we can. Some other benefits, as I said earlier, when we're in the valley, we often can't see well, and the timelines can bring clarity and insights that may not have been noticed earlier. Sometimes we see in other people what we can't see in ourselves, so it shines a light on something. The idea of that is you might be sharing your timeline, but someone else might start to go, oh, that's my timeline too. I should have remembered to put that in my timeline. So there's benefits beyond the individual who's sharing. And then we tend to see patterns that maybe individuals don't see on themselves. And this all ties back to the idea of self-awareness, reflection, and mastery to support them in their ministry leadership in the future. So drawing people out to dig deeper, that's our role. And the skill of helping participants clarify, develop, and refine thoughts and ideas is what we're talking about today. And some of the ways that we do that are open-ended questions, non-directive questions. They can help participants do the deeper thinking and just trying to avoid those close-ended questions. Some of the ways you can do this is to paraphrase the speaker's statements and then ask an open-ended question. So for example, an open-ended question would be something like, tell me more about that, or how so, or what matters to you about that? Can you share an example? So you're digging and getting them to share more information. That's the idea. Closed-ended questions, just in case you don't know, are those questions that really are just a yes or no answer. So we try to avoid those. And then there's directive questions. So directive questions link more to the goal. Like, how long will that take? So you're trying to get them to create a plan. You're directing them to think about the timeline. Or how can you fix that problem? So they've identified the problem, you're directing them to a solution around it. Another one would be pointing I think the point is the directive questions are really pointing people in the right direction, right? You're not giving them the answer, but you're kind of pointing them in a particular direction. And this can interrupt the speaker's own train of thought. So you need to weigh that. If they're going on about something, you might want to use a directive question to bring them back to something that they might have skirted over that may seem significant. And then open-ended questions, as I've shared, help dig deeper. So remember to ask the probing questions. And as I said, closed are yes or no, open, draw out details, and leading questions point or lead to observations and seek validation. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this into practice. Jessica's going to share a little bit of her timeline, and Tiffany and I are going to be the co-facilitator and facilitator. And what we'd like you to do is just take some notes. So if you don't have a pen or something, maybe grab that. What are you observing in the observation? What questions jumped out for you? And what might you have asked? So Jessica, I'll stop sharing. I'm going to put these questions in the chat, and you should be able to share your screen, Jessica.
Can everybody see that?
You got it.
Perfect. So you have to remind me, where do we start when we're sharing in identity with our timelines?
You can pick a turning point, how about, and go
Okay.
over that with us. Yeah.
Okay.
Patterns and turning points you noticed.
Okay. So I think just kind of review, I just went through the facilitator training and I just added this last column as part of doing the training. And I guess just something I caught was, I categorized each of my chapters as sort of growth in plants or like a garden. And so, when I'm younger, things are rooted in home. I'm going to college, things are budding. When we moved to Vancouver, things weren't great. So I described that as sort of like shallow roots.
Mm.
And when we moved to the island, we started to build much stronger communities. So I'm deeper roots and I'm learning a lot more skills and training. So pruning. Then there's a lot of skill building during the pandemic. And I worked at our church for a long time. So I just called that blossoming. But I actually just left my job at church. And I guess this season I'm in right now is kind of like the wilderness, but I also kind of attributed it to like plants having winter rest.
Mm.
And so that was just something I noticed recently with my timeline. But yeah, I was just going over it again and just really reflecting and adding some more turning points for me in this last probably year of my life. So that it's just such a good activity when we first go through it with identity. And now it's super helpful for even clarity in this wilderness time. Yeah.
I love that analogy of the garden. And I'm curious, Jessica, could you describe to me what that garden looks like?
I think it's more like a plant.
Okay.
I don't know it's like a single plant, I guess. But it is something that I thought about that today and was something that you could harvest from. So it obviously is some kind of fruit bearing plant. I couldn't tell you what kind, but it definitely has something you can eat on it.
That's fine. It doesn't tell us in the Bible what type of fruit we bear. It just says we bear fruit.
Oh, there you go.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Jessica, what surprised you about your timeline?
I actually was a little bit surprised at how much like red I had of painful moments. And it's funny because like I don't typically have like a victim mentality. I want to move forward through things and I get frustrated with difficult moments in my life because I want to be progressive and move things forward. And the red is often where I've been stopped or had disagreements or what have you, or really difficult things. Like you can see there, I had a miscarriage and stuff. So really, really challenging things. But I was just kind of looking at how much red there was and kind of surprised myself because I don't feel like life has been that challenging. So that was just a realization in the last couple of weeks, just updating the timeline.
When you noticed that, how did it land with you?
I noticed certain seasons obviously were really difficult. Vancouver, when we were in Vancouver, there's a lot of challenges there. And just remembering that time as being really challenging and but that was also the season, the probably the darkest season where I did not have God in my life at that time, like as strongly as I do now. And it's interesting when we were talking about patterns, that was really interesting to me, that where I was suffering the most, God was sort of my choice absent from my life. And where there's a lot of joy in my life, he was much more present and forefront for me.
Mm. Beautiful.
Mm.
Deb's asking the question, what growth occurred in the red? Love that.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, honestly, every one of those lines that are red, I can attribute with some kind of lesson learned.
Mm.
And you know what, I was also thinking today, like I don't know if you can notice, but my last column has a lot more text in it.
Mhm.
I strayed from just naming one thing and started to write a few more notes about each thing that I was writing down, because I realized I almost want to go back through it maybe and really put more context with the one-liners, and maybe almost like journaling it a little bit more, because I almost don't want to forget some of these things. Like there are people in my life and moments in my life where I'm kind of starting to forget. I'm glad I did this timeline actually, because there are things that came up for me that I had completely forgotten about. And but I would like to go back and add some more context like I have done in this last column, but even go further than that and perhaps really journal in a notebook or something.
Did you notice any specific patterns, Jessica?
I think it really showed me that the strengths that I have, they align with my timeline. Like I think that was really affirming. I'm someone who I have all my strengths are almost all executive, and lots of things are I'm getting things done and helping other people get things done. And the challenging points are points when perhaps I couldn't do in my own power that executive role. Perhaps I was frustrated with someone, or perhaps there was things out of my control. Like I have horrible pregnancies, just mentally I have horrible pregnancies because I'm not in control of them. So I can definitely see a pattern there of it's success for me is when something has been completed, and unsuccessful when I've had conflict with someone or something is out of my control. So definitely seeing patterns there for sure.
Mhm.
Last question for me. Is there any kind of takeaway, like something you want to make sure you're doing as a result of reflecting on this timeline?
Yeah, I think just realizing that I want to keep this up to date.
Mm.
That was something that I realized just going through the training recently, that for myself to think through chapters and to reflect, how helpful is this as a leader to have a written timeline and diary of your leadership life. And I love I was reading the summaries of I wrote the summaries here. I think that was part of the exercise. um it was just sort of like god has created me, and this is my story, and it should be written down. Doesn't mean the whole world needs to know my story. It's not like I want to write a book. That's not who I am. But perhaps, I could tell my daughter one day, like, hey, mommy's timeline is here, and you should start to perhaps do the same activity with your life so that you can see those patterns. I'm always thinking about younger people. Like I'm almost 40 now, and I'm thinking about people who are in their teens and 20s. these steps are so helpful in direction and reflection. So I just love this activity. And again, I went through the PDF as well of how to do it. I hadn't done that in a long time either. And there's so many great tips there of things that you should consider putting in your timeline.
Mm.
So it's just I just love this activity, and I haven't run any identity courses yet, but I'm really excited to bring other people through it as well.
It reminds me, like you said, you want maybe your daughter to look at this, or even to remind yourself of where God's brought you. And it reminds me of the Israelites, and wherever something significant happened, they
Mm.
made something, they planted something, or they made an altar to
Mhm.
remind themselves of what God has done or who God is. So that's really beautiful. It's also very interesting to me how you have like very just like AB or MK in that shallow part, but that's your longest description of what
Mm.
phase is. And there's the least amount of words at the top and the most amount of words at the bottom in that. So
Mm.
be something else to think about.
Mhm.
Mm,
Thank you, Jessica.
yeah, thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
So what kinds of things were you observing in the process of pulling that apart? Ginger, I see your hand up.
She's clapping.
Oh, clapping. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I was clapping. Thank you, Jessica.
You're welcome.
Observations. Glenda?
Yes, just had to find my unmute button here.
Mhm.
I noticed normally when we're running a session, we're focusing in on we're telling them to pick one particular turning point. I mean, I realized for exercise sake, it was good to cover a little bit more ground, and there was nothing really being dived in
Mm.
at depth here. But I love the open-ended questions. It was gave her an opportunity to fill in some more details. And in one case, I heard a revelation that was, oh, I should be doing this, and that came out of that open-ended question. So yay, good on you guys.
Others?
Mm. I think it's hard when we recognize that there's so much anxiety going into sharing for lots of people. And so I like Bethany too, how you were saying your group that you had already knew each other. So they could maybe go a little bit more in depth. But for groups of people who don't know each other at all, maybe there is more comfort in just doing a broad overview and just saying, like, this is how I saw God's hand, but you're not having to go into very explicit detail. And that's fine. If that's how people want to share, that's amazing that they get to, and we get to be just a little part of that story with them. But other groups are going to be totally comfortable really diving in deep into one area. Yeah, Deb.
This is maybe a little off topic. I try and update my resume every year.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, as she was talking about what I learn about myself and what I remember and what's important, and it's not, it's only a resume, right? But it's what is important, what's going on in my life. And I'm thinking about that as I'm doing, and I'm thinking I could incorporate that put the two of them together, and it would be more beneficial for me.
Hmm. Yeah.
Nice.
I love how we get to learn alongside all the participants. And as different things pop up, like we're still all participants in this too, and finding new ways of making this information work for us.
And you're very kind not to say anything, but I actually used a closed-ended question. And thankfully, Jessica took it further than that, but I did ask one. So don't beat yourself up, right? I said, I can't remember specifically what it was, but it was a closed-ended question where she could have just said yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
But she expanded on it. Yeah.
That's my personality. I'd like to talk a lot.
Well, I think just when you hear good questions that really work for you, make sure that you jot them down. Start your own list of questions, right? Keep them handy. There are some in the resources for facilitators, but you know, a couple of them for the timeline can be what surprised you about the timeline, what 3 biggest events have shaped you into who you are today, where do you see God at work? Tell me more about this pattern or event. What's the most positive, impactful event and why? So if they're struggling with it, you can kind of help them hone in on one specific area.
Yeah. And I love the question you asked earlier, Corina, when you were going over your presentation is why does this matter to you? Why
Yeah,
is it important? Because that can be such a freeing question for people.
right.
Mhm.
Great. Well,
Thank
back
you.
to you, Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you, Karina and Jessica, for sharing. I always love timeline conversations. I will admit, I didn't love it as a participant, and I didn't love doing it because I was in the Valley season, but I've come a really long way. So I think I need to update mine and just see what has happened in the last 2.5 years, maybe 3 years since I've taken it. And I love the idea of just updating it because a lot does happen along the way, and we do forget. And I feel like I'm doing a disservice to all that God's done in my life by forgetting. And then I have to relearn the lessons a lot of the time because I forget.